So can I just again say how pleased I am to be as a part of this event today, and how impressed I am with the papers that you have already produced. I've gone through your regional, spatial and economic strategy, and indeed the more recent document of your workshop report. And I have to say I am very impressed at both the breadth of coverage and also within that the detail that you have addressed in your documents, and indeed your ambition, and the most recently uttered one there that you just mentioned, David, about being a carbon neutral region. I think that's exactly the goal to go for, and I think it's entirely feasible within the southern region. So maybe I could just start by looking at what it is we want to achieve as part of this transition. Let's see. Yes, here we are. I suppose it always helps to put numbers on things. You know, if you're trying to lose weight, the first thing you do is look at the scales in the morning. If you're trying to do anything in terms of saving for buying something, you're looking at the numbers of how much money you've saved. And I think in this context, it's very helpful to just be very clear as to what our transition is all about here in Ireland. It's about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and our number today in Ireland is 60. And our challenge is to reduce 60 down to 30 by 2030. Not an easy journey, I would have to say. As you can see from where the emissions are coming from, we have a very large share coming out of agriculture, and that is an intrinsic part of both our economy and our society, and will be a real challenge to find both a socially and economically acceptable transition to reduce the emissions out of agriculture as we go forward. The area of transport is particularly high in Ireland. If you compare that to other parts of Europe, our transport emissions, relatively speaking, are higher, and that's in part because we have a very dispersed population, and relatively speaking, we have a low share of public transport. And then, of course, we also have electricity generating emissions, and we have heating generating emissions. And it might be just interesting to have a look. Now I need to go back up, and I'm not too sure how to do that. Can you move it back to the previous slide, Karen, please?
Mary, if you just click your up button as you would normally.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
Well done, thank you. I think it's useful to try and break down the challenge of the greenhouse gas emissions that we're going to have to reduce. And for today's discussion, I was just going to limit the discussion to energy. And energy, it's 40 million tonnes of emissions, transport 15, heating 12, electricity 12, and these numbers are rounded because to go to the detail is a little bit challenging. I think it's important, though, to understand where the emissions are coming from. If you look at transport, half of our emissions come from you and I getting into our car and driving to the shops, the supermarket, to the nearest town, to Dublin, wherever it might be. That's 50% of our emissions. So it's very much within our control as individuals to have an impact on that number. The emissions for heavy duty transport, a bit more challenging, aviation even more challenging. And then if you look at heating, the issue on heating really relates to buildings. It's probably the biggest part of our heating challenge. We have rural buildings emitting 8 million and urban 4. Am I reading those figures correctly? But in actual fact, the real issue that we're facing here is how we're going to be able to get those emissions to be reduced. And I want to talk about that as we go through, because I think heating has been one of the areas that perhaps hasn't had as much attention for very obvious reasons, in that heating tends to be an individual activity, and it's less easy to bring in large companies, large industry to invest in it, to change it, although there are mechanisms that we can use there. And then, of course, we have electricity, which is our power sector, which is also emitting greenhouse gas emissions, but is probably a world leader in terms of the reductions that have taken place over the last number of years. And indeed, if I just focus for a moment on the electricity sector, the targets in the government plan and the objective of achieving 70% RESE by 2030 will in actual fact save us 7 million tonnes of CO2, which is a huge amount. It's a challenge, of course, but we're well in hand to achieve that. It will come from a mixture of onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar. We know what the numbers are. We pretty much know what the investment is. It's about 12 billion euros that will be invested. But we also will benefit from that, not just from the perspective of reducing emissions, but there's about 6,000, maybe even as many as 9,000 jobs around that rollout of moving to 70% renewable electricity by 2030. But I think there's a very important issue linked to that, and that is just, I use this as an illustration. This is what the wind industry has prepared in terms of how they can achieve their objectives for 2030. And I think the first thing I'd like to say is that their plan is for 8,000 megawatts. And in actual fact, the 30% target will probably need 4,000. But the reason why the plan goes to 8 is because if you look at the various steps along the line, you will have losses. You will have instances where either planning will not be approved, finance will not happen, grid connections will not be possible, companies will change their policies and tactics and directions. So over the period of time, you need to plan for more than you actually expect to have in place in order to deliver it. I think the second issue, and this is very relevant, of course, for I hope most of the people listening, is what are the timelines involved in the steps of rolling out renewable, large-scale renewable energy. And of course, there are a number of administrative steps, planning and others that need to be dealt with and must be dealt with at a local level. And the extent to which these can facilitate the rollout in an efficient way, in a cost-effective way, is an important element in terms of ultimately achieving the objectives that we want to achieve for renewable electricity. And indeed, the Minister mentioned the most recent auction and the results of the RES, and it's true there are 7 community projects within that, and I think that's an excellent result. But it's also interesting to see what kind and where the projects are that came through that auction. And I think you can safely say that it's like as if they're all falling to the bottom of the pile. They're all ending up, well, not all of them, of course, but many of them are in your region, and therefore you will be playing a key role in this context. And what's very interesting about this particular map is the extent to which solar is becoming a real part of our energy system going forward in Ireland. We haven't had that until now. It's a new area for us. Of course, it's a very well-established technology, but it's quite a new area for us, and its rollout will be an important addition to where we're going to go. A lot of the attention on renewable energy tends to focus on electricity. It's big bucks, that's for sure. But in actual fact, one of the key areas that we really need to think about is what we are using in terms of heating, where we're using it. And for heat, one of the important issues that perhaps hasn't received enough attention until now is at what temperature do we need our heat to be? Because as we roll out renewable power in the electricity system, we also need to think about how we can use renewable technologies in our heating system. And again, you see that where the residential sector is the major area for using heat demand, obviously in our buildings and our homes, you see that the rural part of our society has almost 50% of our heat demand. And it's a very interesting chart to look at the last one, where you see what our demand is for high temperature heat. And temperatures up to, say, 100 degrees are achievable using, for example, heat pumps. But when you go up to, say, 200 degrees, and when you think about the industry that's in the southern region, if you look at, say, the co-op sector, where they're using dryers as an integral part of their production process, if you look at the pharma sector, where they also have dryers, the kinds of temperature demand that they have is somewhere of the region of 200 degrees. And heat pumps are not the most obvious technology to be used for that. You can use biomass, and clearly that's an area that needs and could be further developed. And there are issues relating to how we manage to support the industry with high temperature demand to shift to renewable heat as they go forward. And that could be an issue perhaps for another day's discussion as to how and what technologies we need to roll out in order to ensure that. But at a local level, and perhaps at the residential level to start with, there is one area that hasn't been developed much in Ireland that really does present an opportunity when you compare to other countries. And it's very much within the gift of the Southern Regional Assembly to take this up as a challenge and to potentially roll it out. You already have district heating in Tralee. There's one also being rolled out in Tallaght in Dublin. But you can see from this map that most of the towns in the region actually have the opportunity for commercially rolling out district heating. You have the geothermal opportunities in the pink globular pieces in the middle, and then you have excess heat coming from, very large amount of excess heat coming from our industrial sources. If you look over at Ohanich, for example, and in the Limerick area, there is a very large supply of waste heat coming out of those systems. The issue, though, with regard to district heating is initially one of understanding that, yes, this is a technology option that is available, it is proven, and it can deliver results. It is, however, an infrastructure rollout. So it's not possible for an individual to wake up one morning and say, I want district heating, because it cannot be done at an individual level. It can only be done at a collective level, and it's in this context that the local authorities are hugely important in terms of leading the way, one, in explaining to people what district heating is, and secondly, providing for the infrastructure rollout as part of the development plans. And this is one of the areas that is, I would say, becoming quite urgent, because as with any infrastructure rollout, it takes time. It takes time to understand the issue, it takes time to do the costings, it takes time to do the planning preparation, it takes time to do the selection of who's actually going to do the rollout. It takes time, obviously, for people to understand what it is and agree to use it in their homes. So the process of actually developing the district heating system is not a short activity, and it is one that is becoming quite urgent within the Irish context, because it will be almost impossible for us to decarbonise our heating system unless we use these kind of technologies that are very prevalent. If you look at places like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Poland, a lot of the member states have this, and it's a really key area in terms of rolling out decarbonised heating. And in that context, of course, the most important resource for district heating is what we call waste heat opportunities. And we use the word waste, perhaps it's a bit pejorative as a comment, but it is heat that would otherwise just be sent into the atmosphere or sent into our rivers, or indeed sent into the sea, as the case may be. We all know that Ireland is a major centre for data centres. We know that data centres use a lot of power and generate a lot of heat, and they are becoming more and more a source of energy into the system. In fact, this is what the basis for the district heating system in Tallaght. The heat is going to come from the data centre. It's low-grade heat. It will be upgraded through a heat pump system and be made available then to people to use in their houses. So what this really means is that in terms of planning the decarbonisation of our heating system, including at the residential level, it means it has to be an integral part of our industrial policy. They cannot be dealt with as separate issues. The rollout of industry, the rollout of residential, and the interconnection between the two of them, particularly in the heat context, is one that is an integral part of how we're going to achieve our objectives for greenhouse gas emission reductions. And then I'm going to very briefly just touch on transport. Clearly, in the government plan, we have a rollout of 900,000 electric vehicles. That has the potential to save us 3 million tonnes of CO2. But again, It's slow, it's starting to take off. There are barriers. There are barriers in terms of cost, capital cost to purchase these cars. There are barriers in terms of range anxiety. Will I be able to charge my car? Have we got enough publicly accessible charging points? Is there a second-hand market for these cars? Because we all know that the second-hand market for cars is a pretty big part of the car market in Ireland. And until we get into the cycle of second-hand cars, it may be a little bit difficult to move forward as speedily as we would like in this area. But perhaps one of the areas that I'd like to come back on, and the Minister touched on this as well, and I have to say it's one of my own hobby horse points, and that is people power. And I really do believe that this energy transition that we're going through is about energy democracy. It's about allowing individuals to participate in the transition. In the end of the transition will only happen if it's done by people, for people. And part of that process is really incumbent on authorities at all levels, European, national, regional, local level, to facilitate individuals to take their part in this transition. And there's a few maybe basic tenets here that I think could help and support individuals becoming active in the energy transition. I think the first issue is sharing knowledge and giving people a tool that they can work with. I suspect, and maybe I could ask the audience, would you be able to tell me what your own personal consumption of kilowatt hours of energy is every year? And just as an indicator, let me give you the average figures for Ireland. On average, a household will use 4,000 kilowatt hours a year for electricity. They will use 11,000 for heating, and about 10, depending obviously where they are, 1,000 for transport. So the average household in Ireland is using 25,000 kilowatt hours of energy a year across the energy services of heating, transport and power. Once you have that number, then you're in a position to do something about it. But I fear that there are very few people who have a metric that allows them to use as a guide as to how they can change and reduce their energy consumption. And of course, the follow-on from that then is their greenhouse gas emission. There's a small app that you can get. You can punch in your own individual numbers, and it will convert it not just to kilowatts, but also to emissions. But I just think that if people had a tool like that, it allows them to start the process of saying, okay, there's something I need to do with this number. Can I get my number down? I think the second issue then is on technologies. There are technologies for generation and there are technologies for consumption. On the generation side, we talk about heat pumps, and in the Climate and Action Plan, heat pumps, we're talking about rolling out 600,000 heat pumps. You can't do it today, but if you were in a position to go down to your local pub and ask 5 people, what does a heat pump look like? How many of them would be able to tell you what a heat pump looks like? And this is a technology that we have built into as a pivotal part of our emission reduction going forward. And very few people in Ireland have actually seen a heat pump, much less understand how it operates. So understanding the technology, seeing it, being familiar with it is a key part of, I believe, allowing people to participate in this transition. I shouldn't say this perhaps, but I will. I regret greatly that the series that RTE did, Room to Improve, with Dermot Bannon, did wonderful programs on the retrofit of houses and never once showed a heat pump as part of that retrofit. What a lost opportunity. And hopefully if there's another series produced, they might be able to change that. Of course, the second part of technologies available to people is all about energy efficiency. And I'm not going to go through that in too much detail because I'm sure Laura will deal with that when she comes to her presentation. But energy efficiency, retrofit of our buildings, reducing the energy and the emissions that we use in our home while still having comfort, and hopefully even better air quality is a key target of rolling out that whole approach. And there is one very important area, and if you look at your own role, and I'm sure you do this, and certainly as you look across Europe, the role of the local authority in terms of being a trusted partner and in giving reassurance to people of the direction of travel for this transition is a hugely important element. Local authorities have huge trust amongst their populations, and they can provide the expertise and give the reassurance to people that yes, you can go forward, yes, you can make these investments, yes, it will give you a positive return. The Minister mentioned one of the areas that I had shown him some years ago, and I'd just like to mention it. In Flanders, which is the northern part of Belgium, they rolled out solar panels across the roofs, not just of the houses, but indeed all the factories, the barns. Generated power brought those consumers together into what they call Res Co-op. It's a community power company, and they now have 1 million consumers generating the power and using the power that they generate. It's a local power generation centre. It's really very interesting, and they are moving forward on things that the Minister also mentioned about smart meters. I don't have a slide of it now, but one of the key issues as we go forward and gradually shift from fossil fuels to what we hope will be green electricity is that we flatten the demand curve for electricity during the day. And this can be done using demand response, provided we have the tools, the smart meters, and the tariffs that make it economically interesting and financially viable for people to use those and to make it interesting for themselves. So the whole participation of individuals themselves doing their own piece, it might be small, but when you add it together, it becomes a very real part of the energy transition and allows people to take ownership of it. And just as a final comment on that, I think it is important maybe just to draw attention to the public consultation on the microgeneration support scheme. Minister mentioned that as well. I think this is a hugely important consultation. It's still open for, I think, about a week. A number of issues that I think this consultation brings to the fore. There is no doubt at all that microgeneration will be a huge element going forward in our world and in our lives. When you think about it, we have a roof on our houses, we have a roof on our schools, our hospitals, our shops, our businesses. And at the moment, its function is to stop the rain getting into the house. As the cost of solar PV reduces, and it is now very low, progressively, those spaces will be used to generate power using solar PV. More and more. You look at places, if I look at Germany, 50% of the renewable electricity produced in Germany comes from solar PV, of which the largest share comes from farms and barns. If you look at Portugal, for example, in Portugal, you can go to IKEA on a Saturday morning, you can buy 4 panels, put them on your roof, plug it in, and you start to produce for yourself and send it into the grid. There is no precursor requirement, there's no license required, there's no authorization. You simply send an email to your supplier and say, I'm doing it. If I look at Denmark, they have the largest solar PV park in the world, providing power and hot water into their district heating system. So as a technology, it's small, it's very manageable, it's less intrusive than other technologies, it's very easy and very cheap to roll out. So for me, this public consultation is hugely important in order to ensure that it doesn't limit the possibilities. It doesn't exclude individuals or groups or communities from becoming really active in the energy transition and playing their part. So having said that about the consultation, I'm going to finish now, and thank you very much indeed for your attention, and I look forward to the comments and to the future rollout of the implementation plan that you've already mentioned, David, in your introduction. Thank you very much indeed.